Hello there, and welcome to History Tales. Before we begin our journey back to ancient times, I'd love to know, how has your day been treating you? Whether you're listening in the early morning light, during a peaceful afternoon break, or settling down for the evening, you're exactly where you need to be. Are you joining us from a bustling city, a quiet countryside, or perhaps somewhere across the ocean? Wherever you are in this wide world, thank you for choosing to spend this time with us, exploring the past. If you enjoy these gentle journeys through history, please consider subscribing to History Tales. We're building a community of curious souls who find wonder in the stories of those who came before us. Now let's close our eyes and step back over 2,000 years to a world of marble columns, olive groves, and hearts that beat with the same longings we know today. Imagine, if you will, that you're walking through the heart of ancient Athens on a warm morning in the 5th century before Christ. The sun has already begun its climb over the Acropolis, casting long shadows between the marble columns and stone pathways of the Agora. Your sandaled feet move quietly across sun-warmed stones that have witnessed countless conversations, transactions, and fleeting glances between strangers who might become something more. The air carries the scent of olive oil from the merchants' stalls, the sharp tang of fresh wine, and the softer perfume of flowers that young women have tucked into their chitons. Around you, voices rise and fall in a symphony of daily life, merchants calling out their wares, philosophers debating beneath the shade of plane trees, and the gentle murmur of conversations that might be about politics, poetry, or perhaps the quickening of a heart when certain eyes meet across the marketplace. You pause by a fountain where water flows from the mouth of a stone lion, watching as people come and go about their daily business. But today, we're not here to learn about commerce or politics. Today, we're here to uncover something far more intimate and eternal, the story of how people found love in this ancient world. How did hearts connect when society had such different rules? What did it mean to fall in love when marriage was a matter of family honour rather than personal choice? How did people express desire, longing and affection in a world that often kept the sexes apart? As we wander through these stone streets together, we'll discover that while the customs and expectations may have been vastly different from our own, the fundamental human experiences of attraction, courtship and love remain remarkably familiar. The Greeks gave us many words for love: eros for passionate desire, philia for deep friendship, storge for family bonds, and agape for selfless devotion. But they also lived these different forms of love in ways that might surprise us. So come, let us step more deeply into this world of togas and temple steps, where love was both more constrained and more complex than anything we might imagine today. In the gentle shadows of an Athenian courtyard, a 13-year-old girl named Melania sits quietly with her mother, learning to weave patterns that will someday grace her future husband's home. She doesn't yet know his name, though her father has been negotiating with his family for months. This is how love began in ancient Athens, not with a first glance across a crowded room, but with a contract signed between men who had never consulted the hearts that would be bound by their agreement. To understand love in ancient Greece, we must first understand that for most people, marriage came before any possibility of romantic feeling. In Athens, particularly among the wealthy and respectable classes, marriages were arranged as carefully as any other important business transaction. A girl's father would seek out a suitable husband, someone who could provide for his daughter, enhance the family's social standing, and produce legitimate heirs to carry on both family lines. The age gap was often significant and intentional. Men typically married in their late 20s or early 30s, after they had established themselves in their careers and civic duties. Women, however, were married off as soon as they reached puberty, usually between the ages of 12 and 15. The reasoning was practical rather than romantic. A young wife could be moulded to fit her husband's household, would have many childbearing years ahead of her, and would be less likely to have formed inconvenient attachments to other men. Picture, if you can, the wedding day of such a couple. The bride, perhaps 14 years old, has spent weeks preparing with her mother and the household women. Her hair has been arranged in elaborate braids, and she wears her finest chiton, dyed in precious colours and adorned with golden jewellery that represents her family's wealth and status. But as she sits in the women's quarters of her father's house, waiting for the ceremony to begin, she may never have spoken more than a few words to the man she's about to marry. The groom, meanwhile, stands with his friends and male relatives, perhaps feeling a mix of anticipation and duty. He has seen his bride-to-be, of course. The families would have arranged for them to meet briefly in the presence of both sets of parents, but their conversation would have been limited to polite formalities. He knows her dowry, her family's reputation, and her household skills, but he knows nothing of her laughter, her fears, her dreams, or the way her eyes light up when she speaks of things that truly interest her. The wedding ceremony itself was a beautiful affair, full of rituals designed to ensure fertility and prosperity. The couple would share a special cake, and the bride would be ceremonially carried from her father's house to her husband's, symbolising her transition from one family to another. But beneath all the celebration and ritual lay a stark reality. These two people were essentially strangers, bound together by legal and social obligation, rather than any mutual affection or understanding. In this world, the phrase "to love" was personal, but to marry was political, held deep truth. Love, if it came at all, was expected to develop after marriage, not before. A successful marriage was measured not by the happiness of the couple, but by their ability to fulfill their social roles. The husband as provider and civic participant, the wife as manager of the household and mother of legitimate children. Yet even within these constraints, some couples did find genuine affection and partnership. We have evidence from tombstone inscriptions and literary references of husbands and wives who mourned each other deeply, who spoke of love and companionship that had grown over years of shared life. But this love was quiet, domestic, and private, not the passionate romance that we might recognise today. The women of Athens, in particular, lived lives of remarkable restriction when it came to matters of the heart. They were expected to move directly from their father's control to their husbands, with little opportunity to develop their own preferences or to form relationships based on mutual attraction. Their education was limited to household management, weaving, and basic literacy, enough to run a home efficiently, but not enough to engage in the intellectual discourse that men valued in their friendships and social relationships. And so, in the shadows of marble temples dedicated to gods of love and beauty, the reality of human relationships was far more pragmatic and constrained than the myths and poetry might suggest. Marriage was the foundation of society, but it was built on duty rather than desire, on family honour rather than personal happiness. The sun reaches its zenith over Athens, and while men gather in the agora for business and philosophy, the women of respectable families remain largely invisible, moving through their days in the quiet spaces of courtyards and inner chambers. To understand love and courtship in ancient Greece, we must step into this shadow world, where half the population lived their lives according to rules that seem almost impossible to imagine today. In Athens, the ideal woman was one who was rarely seen, and even more rarely heard outside her own household. The famous statesman Pericles once declared that the best woman was she about whom nothing was said among men, whether for good or ill. This wasn't merely a preference, it was a social requirement that shaped every aspect of how women could form relationships, express feelings, or find love. Imagine Penthesilea, the 16-year-old daughter of a wealthy Athenian merchant. Her days begin before dawn in the gynekonitis, the women's quarters of her father's house. These rooms, often located in the most interior part of the home, are her entire world. Here she spends her time with her mother, sisters, female slaves, and occasional visits from female relatives and friends. She's been taught to weave intricate patterns, to manage household stores, to prepare food, and to conduct herself with the quiet dignity expected of her class. But Penthesilea is also 17, with a quick mind and curious nature that her restricted life cannot entirely suppress. She finds herself wondering about the voices she hears from the men's quarters when her father entertains guests. She catches fragments of discussions about politics, philosophy, and distant lands, and she yearns to know more. Yet she knows that to express such curiosity openly would be seen as unwomanly and inappropriate. When Penthesilea does venture outside her home, it is only for specific, acceptable purposes: religious festivals, visits to female relatives, or trips to the market accompanied by a slave. Even then, she must keep her eyes modestly downcast, speak only when necessary, and certainly never engage in conversation with men who are not family members. The idea of forming friendships with men, let alone romantic attachments, is nearly impossible under such circumstances. Yet human nature finds a way, even within the most restrictive social systems. During the religious festivals that punctuated the Athenian calendar, young women would have opportunities to see and be seen, even if they could not freely interact. The Panathenaea, the great festival honouring Athena, brought together people from all levels of society. Young women would participate in processions, carrying sacred objects or baskets of offerings, and for these brief public moments they might catch the eye of a young man or receive admiring glances that would be remembered long after the festival ended. These festivals also provided one of the few opportunities for families to observe potential marriage partners for their children. A young man might notice a particular girl's grace as she performed ritual dances, or her family's obvious prosperity as displayed in her clothing and jewellery. Similarly, a girl might steal glances at the young men participating in athletic competitions or military displays, knowing that one of them might someday be chosen as her husband by her father. The contrast with Sparta could not have been more dramatic. In that militaristic city-state, the roles of women were defined by entirely different priorities. Spartan women were expected to be physically strong so they could bear strong warriors, and this practical goal led to a remarkably different daily experience. Spartan girls exercised publicly, often wearing minimal clothing that would have scandalized their Athenian counterparts. They learned to read and write, participated in competitive sports, and were encouraged to speak their minds. Most intriguingly, Spartan marriage customs allowed for forms of courtship that would have been impossible in Athens. The typical Spartan marriage began with a ritualized abduction, but this kidnapping was often pre-arranged and served as a form of extended courtship. The couple would meet secretly for months or even years before their relationship was publicly acknowledged. During this time, they could develop genuine emotional and physical intimacy, something that was virtually impossible for their Athenian counterparts. Even within Sparta's more permissive system, women still had limited control over their ultimate fate, but they at least had the possibility of forming real emotional connections with their future husbands. Some Spartan women were even known to have refused marriages that were politically advantageous but personally distasteful, a form of agency that Athenian women could barely imagine. In both city-states, however, women's primary value was understood to be their ability to produce legitimate heirs. The Greek word for marriage, gamos, was closely related to words meaning to generate or to produce. Women were vessels for continuing family lines, not individuals with their own desires and dreams. This biological determinism shaped every aspect of how romantic relationships could develop. Yet within these severe limitations, women found ways to create meaning, connection, and even forms of love. The bonds between women, mothers and daughters, sisters, female friends, often provided the deepest emotional connections of their lives. In the women's quarters, they shared stories, supported each other through childbirth and loss, and created a rich interior world that men never saw or understood. As evening falls over Athens and the household duties of the day come to an end, we hear the sound of lyres and laughter drifting from the andron, the men's dining room of a wealthy citizen's home. Tonight, like many nights, a symposium is beginning. These gatherings were far more than simple dinner parties. They were the beating heart of male social life in ancient Greece, and within their wine-warmed atmosphere, we find some of the most complex and fascinating aspects of Greek approaches to love and desire. Picture yourself as an invisible observer in this scene. The room is lit by oil lamps that cast dancing shadows on walls, decorated with scenes of gods and heroes. Couches are arranged around the room's perimeter, and on each couch 2 men recline side by side, following the ancient custom of sharing dining space. The symposiarch, the chosen leader of the evening's festivities, has already mixed the wine with water in careful proportions, too much water, and the evening will be dull, too little, and it will descend into chaos. The men present represent the cream of Athenian society: politicians, poets, wealthy merchants, and philosophers. They have spent the day in their various public roles, but here in this intimate setting, they can explore ideas and relationships that the formal world doesn't permit. As the wine begins to flow and the conversation deepens, the topics shift from business and politics to more personal matters: beauty, desire, the nature of love itself. But there are women present at this gathering too, and their presence reveals one of the most intriguing contradictions of Athenian society. These are not the wives and daughters of the men present. Respectable women would never attend such a gathering. Instead, they are heterai, a class of women whose very existence challenges everything we might assume about women's roles in ancient Greece. Aspasia reclines gracefully on a couch near the symposiarch, her intelligent eyes following the conversation with obvious understanding and interest. She is a hetera, literally a companion, and her life represents a fascinating alternative to the constrained existence of married women. Unlike wives who are valued primarily for their ability to bear legitimate children and manage households, heterai were prized for their education, wit, and conversational skills. Many hetairai were foreigners, which meant they stood outside the normal social structures that govern citizen women. This outsider status, while limiting in some ways, also provided them with remarkable freedom. Aspasia has learned to read and write, not just basic household accounts, but poetry and philosophy. She can discuss politics, art and literature with the most educated men of her time. She moves freely through the city, attends public events, and participates in intellectual discourse that would be impossible for a citizen wife. The relationships between heterae and their male companions were complex and varied greatly. Some were purely transactional, but others developed into deep, lasting partnerships that resembled marriage in everything but legal status. Pericles, the great Athenian statesman, lived with Aspasia for many years in what appears to have been a relationship of genuine mutual respect and affection. She was said to have influenced his political thinking, and he clearly valued her counsel on important matters. Tonight, as the symposium deepens into philosophical discussion, we see how these relationships could flourish in ways that marriages often could not. When one of the men poses a question about the nature of beauty, Aspasia responds with a thoughtful analysis that draws on both poetry and philosophy. Her words are met not with the shocked silence that would greet such intellectual display from a wife, but with appreciative attention and engaged debate. The conversations at symposia often turned to love itself, and the Greeks made careful distinctions between different types of desire and affection. They spoke of noble love that inspired virtue and wisdom, and of base love that was merely physical. They debated whether true love was possible between equals, or if it required the dynamic tension of difference, in age, in status, in wisdom. These discussions weren't merely theoretical. The symposium provided a social space where different forms of relationships could be observed and evaluated. The connection between a man and his hetero companion might be analysed alongside the bonds of friendship between male citizens, the mentoring relationships between older and younger men, and even the distant, duty-bound marriages that provided social stability but little emotional satisfaction. As the evening progresses and the wine continues to flow, the atmosphere becomes more relaxed and intimate. Poetry is recited, much of it dealing with themes of love and desire. Sometimes the men compose impromptu verses for each other, or for the women present. Music is played, and occasionally there is dancing. In this atmosphere, removed from the formal constraints of daily public life, relationships could develop and deepen in ways that would be impossible elsewhere. Some of the heterae formed long-term relationships with particular men, relationships that provided them with economic security and social position, while offering their partners intellectual companionship and emotional intimacy that their marriages could not provide. These relationships often endured for many years, and when they ended, it was usually due to external pressures rather than lack of affection. The tragedy, of course, was that such rich, fulfilling relationships remained largely impossible within marriage. The same men who valued wit, intelligence, and conversational skill in their hetero companions were married to women who had been deliberately kept ignorant of the very subjects that made for engaging discourse. The system that produced educated, interesting heterae also ensured that wives remained intellectual strangers to their husbands. Yet within these limitations and contradictions, we see evidence of genuine human connection and affection. The symposium, for all its exclusivity and complexity, created a space where at least some forms of love could flourish, where intellectual and emotional intimacy could develop, and where the human need for understanding and companionship could find expression. The morning sun filters through the columns of the gymnasium, illuminating a scene that would seem both familiar and foreign to modern eyes. Young men practice wrestling and running while their elders watch and occasionally offer instruction. But some of these relationships between older and younger men were more complex than simple athletic mentorship, representing one of the most culturally specific aspects of Greek approaches to love and education. In the aristocratic circles of Athens and other Greek city-states, relationships between adult men and adolescent boys were not only accepted, but were considered an important part of a young man's education and social development. These relationships known as pederasty, were structured, ritualized, and governed by specific social expectations and boundaries. Imagine Lysander, a respected citizen in his 30s, who has achieved success in business and civic affairs. He notices young Cleomenes, perhaps 15 or 16 years old, the son of another prominent family. Cleomenes shows promise. He's intelligent, athletic, and displays the kind of character that suggests he could become a valuable member of Athenian society. According to the social customs of his time, Lysander might legitimately pursue a relationship that would combine mentorship, emotional attachment, and physical affection. This courtship would follow established patterns. Lysander might begin by offering gifts, a fighting cock, a hare, or athletic equipment. He would attend the gymnasium to watch Cleomenes train, and he might offer to help with the young man's education, introducing him to important political figures, teaching him about civic duties, or helping him develop skills that would serve him well in adult life. If the relationship developed, it would be understood to serve multiple purposes. For the younger partner, it provided access to an experienced mentor who could guide his development into full citizenship. For the older partner, it offered the opportunity to shape a promising young person while enjoying a relationship that combined intellectual, emotional, and physical elements. However, it's crucial to understand that these relationships were heavily regulated by social expectations. The older partner, known as the erastes or lover, was expected to be the active pursuer, while the younger partner, the eromenos or beloved, was expected to be more passive and eventually receptive rather than eagerly participating. The relationship was understood to be temporary, lasting perhaps a few years until the younger partner reached full adulthood, and would then ideally transition into marriage and his own role as a potential mentor to the next generation. The physical aspects of these relationships were also governed by specific expectations. The older partner was expected to be respectful and not to demand anything that would compromise the younger partner's dignity or future social standing. There were clear distinctions between acceptable and unacceptable behaviour, and violations of these norms could result in social disgrace for both parties. These relationships were most prominent in Athens and were less accepted or practiced in other Greek city-states. In Sparta, for example, while older and younger men formed close bonds through military training, the structure and expectations were quite different. Spartan society emphasised collective military identity over individual romantic relationships, and the mentoring relationships that did exist were more focused on martial skills than on the broader cultural education valued in Athens. What's perhaps most important for modern readers to understand is that these relationships existed within a completely different framework of understanding about education, society, and human development. They were not seen as alternatives to heterosexual marriage, but as a specific phase in a young man's development, ideally leading to greater wisdom, better social connections, and preparation for adult responsibilities. The philosophical justification for these relationships was often quite sophisticated. Plato, in his dialogue Phaedrus, explored the idea that love between men could inspire both partners to virtue and wisdom. He distinguished between noble love that elevated both individuals and base love that was merely concerned with physical satisfaction. In his ideal, the relationship between Erastes and Eromenos would inspire both to become better people. The older man through his care and guidance of his beloved, the younger through his desire to live up to his mentor's expectations. Yet even within Greek society, these relationships were not universally accepted or practiced. Many families preferred to keep their sons away from such influences. and there were always critics who argued that such relationships were corrupting or unnecessary. The comic playwright Aristophanes often mocked the pretensions of these relationships, suggesting that they were sometimes mere excuses for sexual exploitation rather than genuine mentorship. As these young men matured, the expectation was that they would transition into more conventional adult roles. The Eromenos would eventually marry, have children, and perhaps become an Erastes himself to a new generation of young men. The system was designed to be cyclical, with each generation passing on not just practical knowledge, but also cultural values about beauty, virtue, and the proper conduct of relationships. The emotional reality of these relationships was undoubtedly complex. Some developed into lasting friendships that continued well into adulthood, even after both parties had married and assumed conventional family roles. Others ended more abruptly, perhaps causing pain and disappointment for one or both partners. Some may have been exploitative, while others represented genuine care and mutual benefit. What's clear is that these relationships provided an outlet for emotional and intellectual intimacy between men that their marriages often could not offer. In a society where marriages were arranged for practical rather than romantic reasons, where husbands and wives often remained relative strangers to each other, these mentoring relationships allowed for the expression of affection, the sharing of ideas, and the development of deep personal bonds. The legacy of these relationships is complex and continues to be debated by historians and classicists. They represent one of the ways that Greek society attempted to structure and channel human desires and relationships, but they also reflect the limitations and inequalities of that society. They remind us that concepts of love, mentorship, and appropriate relationships are deeply cultural and have varied dramatically across different times and places. As the afternoon sun wanes and we find ourselves in the quiet corner of a private library, surrounded by papyrus scrolls containing some of the most beautiful love poetry ever written, we discover that while the Greeks may have lived constrained romantic lives, their imaginations soared with visions of love that still move us today. In their myths, their poetry, and their art, they explored emotional territories that their society often forbade them to inhabit in reality. The pantheon of Greek gods provided a rich tapestry of love stories that ranged from tender to tragic to scandalous. At the centre of it all was Aphrodite, the goddess of love and beauty, who emerged from sea foam and immediately began causing havoc in the hearts of both mortals and immortals. Aphrodite was no gentle, nurturing figure. She was passionate, jealous, and often cruel, representing the dangerous power of desire, unchecked by social convention. Consider the story of Aphrodite and Adonis, the beautiful young hunter whom she loved with such intensity that she abandoned her divine duties to spend time with him in the forests. When Adonis was killed by a wild boar, Aphrodite's grief was so profound that she caused red flowers, possibly poppies or anemones, to spring from his blood. This myth spoke to something deep in the Greek understanding of love, that true passion was dangerous, transformative, and often ended in loss. Equally powerful was Eros, often portrayed as Aphrodite's son, who personified the sudden, overwhelming nature of romantic attraction. Unlike the chubby cherub of later Roman and Renaissance art, the Greek Eros was often depicted as a powerful, sometimes cruel young man whose arrows could strike anyone at any moment, causing them to fall helplessly in love. The Greeks understood that desire was not always convenient, not always appropriate, and not always returned. Eros represented the arbitrary nature of attraction that could disrupt the most carefully ordered life. Perhaps no myth captured the tragic nature of love better than the story of Orpheus and Eurydice. Orpheus, the greatest musician who ever lived, fell deeply in love with the nymph Eurydice. Their happiness was brief. On their wedding day, Eurydice was bitten by a snake and died. Orpheus's grief was so profound that his music could move stones to weep and wild beasts to lie down in sorrow. He travelled to the underworld itself, singing his way past every obstacle until he reached Hades and Persephone, the king and queen of the dead. Even these harsh rulers were moved by Orpheus's music and his obvious love for his wife. They agreed to let Eurydice return to life, but with one condition: Orpheus must walk ahead of her and not look back until they both reached the upper world. The myth tells us that just as they were about to emerge from the underworld, Orpheus's love overcame his discipline. He turned to look at his beloved Eurydice, and she faded away forever, lost to him twice over. This story resonated deeply with Greek audiences because it captured several fundamental truths about love as they understood it. That it was the most powerful force in human experience, that it often led to tragedy, and that the very intensity that made it beautiful also made it dangerous. The poetry of Sappho provides us with some of the most intimate and immediate expressions of romantic longing to survive from the ancient world. Writing on the island of Lesbos in the 6th century before Christ, Sappho created verses that speak directly to the physical and emotional experience of desire in ways that feel startlingly modern. In one of her most famous fragments, she writes of seeing a woman she loves, talking and laughing with a man, and describes the physical symptoms of jealousy. That man seems to me peer of gods that sits facing you, and hears close by your sweet speech and lovely laughter. Oh, it puts the heart in my chest on wings for when I look at you. Even a moment, no speaking is left in me. No, tongue breaks, and thin fire is racing under skin, and in eyes no sight, and drumming fills ears, and cold sweat holds me, and shaking grips me all. Greener than grass I am, and dead, or almost I seem to me. This is love poetry of extraordinary immediacy and power, describing the physical reality of desire with an honesty that was rare in Greek literature. Sappho wrote primarily about love between women, and while we don't know exactly how such relationships were understood in her social context, her poetry suggests that she experienced and celebrated forms of emotional and physical intimacy that were clearly meaningful and valuable to her. Another fragment preserves her memory of a beloved who is left. Some say cavalry, and others claim infantry, or a fleet of long oars, is the supreme sight on the dark earth. I say it is the one you love, and easily proved. Did not Helen, who far surpassed all mortals in beauty, desert the best of men, her husband, and sail far off to Troy? Not for her children or beloved parents had she a care, but led astray by love. Here Sappho uses the great mythological example of Helen of Troy to argue that love is more powerful than all the military might and social obligation that men value. Helen abandoned husband, children, and duty for love, and while this choice led to the Trojan War and tremendous suffering, Sappho seems to suggest that the choice itself was understandable, even admirable. The contrast between Sappho's passionate personal poetry and the more formal public love poetry written by men is striking. Male poets like Pindar wrote elaborate odes celebrating the beauty of young men, but these poems were often more concerned with social display and poetic technique than with genuine emotional expression. Sappho's work feels more intimate and immediate, perhaps because she was writing from a position outside the mainstream of male-dominated literary culture. The myths and poetry of ancient Greece also gave us some of our most enduring symbols and metaphors for love. The idea of being struck by Cupid's arrow, the notion of a face that launched 1,000 ships, the image of lovers willing to brave the underworld itself for their beloved. All of these came from Greek sources and continue to shape how we think and talk about romantic experience. What's particularly fascinating is how the Greeks used mythology to explore emotional territories that their social structures made difficult to navigate in real life. In the stories of gods and heroes, they could imagine love that was purely chosen, relationships based on mutual attraction rather than family arrangement, and the triumph of personal desire over social obligation. They could explore the idea that love might be worth any sacrifice, even life itself. These myths and poems served as a kind of emotional outlet for a society that heavily regulated actual romantic relationships. In their art and literature, the Greeks could celebrate passionate love, equal partnerships between lovers, and the idea that romantic fulfillment was one of life's greatest goods. The fact that these ideals were so different from the reality of most people's lives perhaps made them all the more powerful and appealing. In the soft twilight hour, when the streets of Athens grow quiet and most respectable citizens have retired to their homes, we might catch glimpses of a different side of Greek romantic life, one where human nature found ways to circumvent social restrictions, where hearts followed their own desires, despite the rules that governed public behaviour. For even in the most regulated society, love has always found a way to express itself, sometimes in whispers and shadows, sometimes in bold gestures that defied convention. Let us imagine a scene at the Panathenaic festival, that grand celebration honouring Athens' patron goddess. Among the crowds gathered to watch the procession, we might notice subtle dramas of attraction and flirtation playing out despite all the social rules designed to prevent such interactions. There, near the temple steps, a young woman named Thalia walks with her family, carrying a basket of offerings, as her role in the ceremony requires. Her eyes remain modestly downcast as befits her station, but occasionally they flicker upward to catch sight of a particular young man who's been appearing wherever she goes throughout the festival. This is Demetrios, and while they have never spoken directly, they have developed their own secret language of glances and small gestures. Yesterday, when Thalia's family visited the market, she found a perfect red apple placed carefully on her family's doorstep. This morning, when she went to the well with the household slaves, there was a small wildflower tucked into the stone where she typically rests her water jug. These gifts have no words attached, no signature, but she knows they come from the young man who watches her with such obvious admiration. This courtship of signs and symbols was one of the few ways that young people could express romantic interest within the constraints of their society. Apples were particularly popular as tokens of affection, perhaps because of their association with Aphrodite. A red apple given to someone was a clear declaration of romantic interest, while accepting and eating the apple was understood as a positive response. Flowers, particularly roses and violets, carried similar meanings. Sometimes these tokens were more elaborate and expensive. A young man from a wealthy family might commission a piece of jewellery, perhaps a gold pin or bracelet, and find a way to have it delivered to the object of his affections. If she wore the jewellery publicly, it was a signal that his interest was welcomed. If she did not, he would understand that his advances were not appreciated. The religious festivals provided some of the safest opportunities for these romantic communications to take place. During the celebration of Dionysus, when normal social rules were temporarily relaxed and people wore masks or costumes, young men and women could interact more freely. The festival of Aphrodite created an atmosphere where expressions of romantic feeling were not only permitted but encouraged. But not all romantic relationships in ancient Greece followed the official rules. Despite the severe restrictions placed on respectable women, affairs did happen, and when they did, they required considerable ingenuity and risk-taking. A married woman who fell in love with someone other than her husband faced not just social disgrace, but potentially severe legal consequences, including divorce with loss of dowry and children. Yet the archaeological record provides us with fascinating evidence that such affairs did occur. We have discovered numerous lead tablets, called defictiones or binding spells, buried in ancient graveyards or thrown into sacred wells. These tablets contain magical spells designed to inflame someone's heart with love, to cause them to forget their current lover, or to bind them romantically to the person commissioning the spell. One such tablet, found in Athens and dating to the 4th century before Christ, reads, "I bind Theodora to Carpos in marriage and love and sexual intercourse, and I put a spell upon her so that she will love no other man but Carpos, and so that Carpos alone will marry Theodora and no other woman." The tablet was rolled up tightly and pierced with an iron nail before being buried, following the ritual requirements for such magic spells. These binding spells tell us several important things about romantic life in ancient Greece. First, that people often fell in love with individuals who were not available to them through normal social channels. Second, that they were willing to resort to magic when conventional approaches failed. And third, that they understood love to be something that could be influenced by supernatural forces, not just a matter of rational choice or social arrangement. Some of the most poignant binding spells were commissioned by women who had lost their lovers to arranged marriages or social pressure. One tablet reads, "Just as this lead grows cold and is useless, so may Philemon grow cold and useless for every woman except me, Antigone. And may he remember only me and our love, and may he come to me burning with desire." The tablets also reveal the practical challenges faced by people trying to conduct secret romances. They ask not just for love, but for opportunities to meet, for protection from discovery, and for their beloved to be able to get away from spouses or parents without suspicion. The magic was expected to create not just emotional attachment, but practical circumstances that would allow the relationship to flourish. Some love affairs were conducted through intermediaries, trusted slaves, sympathetic relatives, or friends who could carry messages and arrange secret meetings. A few surviving letters, written on papyrus and preserved by Egypt's dry climate, give us glimpses of these clandestine relationships. They speak of stolen moments in temple courtyards, secret meetings during religious processions, and the constant fear of discovery. Even in a world ruled by duty and social obligation, hearts still wandered, still yearned, and still found ways to connect across the barriers that society erected. As our journey through the romantic world of ancient Greece draws toward its close, we pause to consider how these ancient patterns of love and desire would echo through the centuries, shaping the very language we use to describe our emotions and the ideals we pursue in our own relationships. The Romans, practical as always, adopted and adapted Greek ideas about love, but with their own distinctive emphasis on duty and social order. Roman marriages remained largely practical arrangements, but Roman poets like Ovid and Catullus wrote passionately about romantic love in ways that built directly on Greek models. The Roman concept of romantic love as a form of pleasant madness something that could inspire great art, but also great foolishness, came directly from Greek sources. During the Renaissance, European scholars rediscovered Greek texts and found in them a vision of love that seemed both more sophisticated and more passionate than medieval Christian ideals. The Renaissance concept of courtly love, with its emphasis on the ennobling power of romantic devotion, drew heavily on Platonic ideas about love-inspiring virtue and wisdom. Perhaps most importantly, the Greeks gave us our vocabulary for understanding the different types of love we experience. The 4 Greek words for love, agape, eros, philia and storge, continue to provide useful distinctions for understanding the complex landscape of human affection. Agape represented selfless, unconditional love, the kind of love that seeks the good of the beloved above all else. While the Greeks understood this concept, it would later be adopted by early Christians to describe divine love and the ideal form of human compassion. Eros was passionate, sexual desire, the overwhelming attraction that could strike like lightning and transform a person's entire life. The Greeks understood that Eros was powerful, but potentially dangerous, capable of inspiring both great beauty and great destruction. Philia described deep friendship, the bond between people who chose each other as companions and who shared common values and interests. This was perhaps the most valued form of love in Greek society, seen as more stable and more morally worthy than the turbulent passions of Eros. Storge was family love, the natural affection between parents and children, siblings and extended family members. This was understood to be instinctual and necessary for social stability, but not necessarily chosen in the way that philia was. These distinctions allowed the Greeks to think about love in sophisticated ways, recognizing that the word love could describe very different emotional experiences with very different social implications and moral values. The Greek understanding of love as something complex and multifaceted influenced later Western literature, philosophy and psychology. When Shakespeare's characters debate whether love is madness or wisdom, they're echoing conversations that took place in Greek symposia. When modern therapists help couples distinguish between passionate attraction and deeper compatibility, they're using conceptual tools that the Greeks developed. The tension between individual desire and social duty that characterized Greek approaches to love continues to resonate in modern romantic life. We still struggle with questions about whether love should be based on practical compatibility or passionate attraction, whether marriages should serve individual happiness or family interests, and how to balance personal fulfillment with social responsibility. As we prepare to leave this ancient world and return to our own time, imagine one final scene with me. We are walking through an olive grove outside Athens as the sun sets, painting the ancient trees silver and gold. The air is warm and fragrant with the scent of wild herbs and distant cooking fires. Somewhere in the distance, we can hear the faint sound of a lyre and voices raised in song. In this peaceful moment, we can reflect on what we have discovered about love in ancient Greece. We have seen a world where social structures severely limited individual choice in romantic matters, where marriages were arranged for practical rather than emotional reasons, and where men and women often lived in separate spheres with little opportunity for genuine companionship. Yet we have also seen evidence of deep human longing that could not be entirely suppressed by social convention. In the passionate poetry of Sappho, in the complex relationships between symposium companions, in the secret gifts left by unknown admirers, and in the magic spells buried in sacred places, we find proof that the human heart has always sought connection. beauty, and understanding. The Greeks may not have had dating apps or romantic comedies, but they experienced the same fundamental emotions that move us today: the flutter of attraction across a crowded space, the joy of finding someone who truly understands us, the pain of unrequited love, and the deep satisfaction of companionship that endures over time. Their myths and poetry continue to provide us with some of our most powerful images and metaphors for romantic experience. When we speak of being struck by Cupid's arrow, of a love that could launch 1,000 ships, or of someone willing to brave hell itself for their beloved, we are using language and concepts that originated in ancient Greece. Perhaps most importantly, the Greeks taught us that love is not simple or singular, but complex and multifaceted. Their distinction between different types of love, passionate eros, loyal philia, nurturing storge, and selfless agape, gives us tools for understanding our own emotional lives and relationships. Today, we swipe through profiles and search for connection through screens. But thousands of years ago, under this same Mediterranean moonlight, others did the same. Through glances exchanged at temple festivals, through carefully chosen gifts left where they would be found, through poetry written in the secret chambers of the heart. The forms may change, but the fundamental human desire for love, understanding, and connection remains constant across the centuries. In learning about how the ancient Greeks approached these eternal questions, we learn something not just about them, but about ourselves. So as you drift towards sleep tonight, wherever you are in this wide world, remember that you are part of a story that stretches back through countless generations. The longing you feel, the joy you've known in love, the heartbreak you've survived, all of this connects you to every human being who has ever lived, including those ancient Greeks who walked these same paths under these same stars. May the echoes of ancient love carry you gently into dreams, and may you wake tomorrow with a deeper appreciation for the timeless mystery of the human heart. Good night from all of us at History Tales, and thank you for joining us on this journey through time. Hello there, and welcome to another gentle journey through history with History Tales. Before we settle in together for tonight's story, I'd love to know, how has your day been treating you? Whether you're listening to this in the quiet hours of evening, perhaps with a cup of tea growing cool beside you, or maybe it's the middle of the night where you are in the world, and sleep feels just out of reach. Wherever you find yourself tonight, whether you're in a cosy bedroom in London, a small apartment in Tokyo, or perhaps listening under the stars somewhere in the American countryside, you found the right place to let your mind wander back to gentler times. If you enjoy these peaceful explorations of the past, do remember to subscribe to History Tales. We're here every week with more stories designed to carry you softly into sleep, filled with the fascinating details of how people lived, loved, and dreamed in centuries gone by. Tonight we're stepping back into the gaslit world of Victorian England, where romance moved at the pace of a slow waltz, and every glance held meaning. So settle back, let your breathing slow, and allow yourself to drift into the soft candlelit world of what dating was really like when your great-great-grandmother might have been young. Picture, if you will, the London of 1875. The sun has just set behind a veil of soft grey clouds, and the lamplighter is making his evening rounds down Grosvenor Square. His footsteps echo against wet cobblestones, each gas lamp blooming to life with a gentle hiss and a warm, amber glow that pushes back the gathering dusk. Horse-drawn carriages clatter past, their wheels creating a rhythmic percussion against the stones, while ladies in long velvet coats hurry along the sidewalks, their kid leather boots clicking softly, their faces turned down against the evening mist. This is the world where love moved slowly, deliberately, like honey dripping from a silver spoon. The Victorian era, that long stretch of history from 1837 to 1901, was governed by rules as intricate as the lacework that adorned every lady's collar. These weren't arbitrary restrictions, but rather a complex social choreography that everyone understood, from the scullery maid polishing silver in the basement to the Duchess adjusting her pearl necklace in her gilt-framed mirror. In this world, a young man couldn't simply approach a young woman on the street and strike up a conversation. To do so would have been as shocking as appearing at church in one's nightclothes. Everything had its proper place, its proper time, its proper form. A gentleman removed his hat when greeting a lady. A lady never walked alone after dark. Children were seen and not heard. And courtship was perhaps the most carefully orchestrated dance of all. The word dating didn't even exist in the Victorian vocabulary. What we might call a casual relationship was instead keeping company, and it was anything but casual. When a young man showed interest in a young woman, he was understood to be considering her as a potential wife. There was no such thing as dating multiple people, no concept of seeing where things might go. Courtship was serious business, conducted under the watchful eyes of parents, chaperones, and society at large. A single glance exchanged across a drawing room might be the most intimate moment two young people shared that entire month. And yet, within that glance, volumes could be communicated. The tilt of a head, the flutter of an eyelash, the way a lady's fingers played with the ribbon at her throat. These tiny gestures carried the weight of sonnets in a world where direct expression of romantic feeling was considered unseemly. The importance of proper etiquette cannot be overstated in understanding Victorian romance. Young ladies spent years learning the subtle art of conversation, the proper way to enter and exit a room, how to sit with perfect posture for hours in their stays and crinolines. They practiced the piano not merely for personal enjoyment, but because the ability to play a gentle nocturne in the parlour after dinner was considered essential to attracting a suitable husband. Gentlemen, too, had their elaborate codes of conduct. They learned which fork to use for the fish course, how to assist a lady from a carriage without impropriety, and the precise angle at which to bow when introduced to someone new. A man's reputation could be made or broken by his adherence to these social niceties, and a woman would never consider seriously courting someone who couldn't navigate the intricate maze of Victorian propriety. As the evening settles deeper around us, and perhaps the rain begins to tap gently against your window, imagine what it felt like to live in such a structured world. There was something deeply comforting about it, the certainty of knowing exactly how to behave in any given situation, the security of unbreakable social bonds, the way everyone from the flower seller on the corner to the lord in his manor house understood their place in the great tapestry of society. The Victorian parlour was a stage set for romance, though never would such a bold word have been spoken aloud in those hushed, carpet-muffled rooms. Picture yourself entering through heavy oak doors into a sanctuary of burgundy velvet and polished mahogany. The air carries the faint scent of beeswax candles and the dried lavender tucked into small glass bowls on every surface. Afternoon light filters through lace curtains, casting intricate shadows that dance across the Persian rugs and gleam on the curved legs of delicate rosewood chairs. Here in these carefully appointed chambers, the delicate business of courtship unfolded like a complex musical composition. The parlour was where families displayed their finest possessions, the good china brought out only for special occasions, the family portraits in their heavy gilt frames, the pianoforte with its ivory keys worn smooth by countless hours of practice. But more than showcasing material wealth, the parlour served as a kind of theatre where young people could observe each other's character, manners, and suitability as marriage partners. Most romantic relationships began not through chance encounters or personal choice, but through the intricate web of family connections and social obligations that bound Victorian society together. A young man might meet his future bride at a ball hosted by mutual friends, or perhaps she would be introduced to him after Sunday service at the family church. Tea parties, garden parties, and evening soirees all served as carefully orchestrated opportunities for eligible young people to meet under appropriate supervision. Once an introduction had been properly made, never, ever directly between the young people themselves, but always through a mutual acquaintance or family member, the real courtship could begin. And it began invariably in the parlour. The young gentleman would call upon the young lady at her family home, usually during the prescribed visiting hours of afternoon tea time. He would be received in the front parlour, the most formal room in the house, while the young lady's mother or other chaperone remained tactfully nearby, perhaps in an adjoining room, with the door left strategically ajar. The conversations that took place during these early visits were as carefully choreographed as a minuet. The weather was always a safe topic. Had the young lady noticed how particularly fine the roses were blooming this season? Perhaps the gentleman had observed some interesting cloud formations on his morning ride through the park. Books provided another acceptable avenue for discourse. Had she read the latest volume of poetry by Mr. Tennyson? Did he find Mr. Dickens's newest novel as engaging as his previous works? Music, too, served as both conversation topic and courtship tool. A young lady who could play the piano with skill and feeling was considered highly accomplished, and the gentleman caller might request a song or two during his visit. Picture the scene: the late afternoon sun slanting through the windows, illuminating dust motes that dance in the air like tiny golden spirits, while the young woman's fingers move gracefully over the keys, playing perhaps a gentle waltz or a melancholy ballad. The young man sits nearby, careful to maintain proper distance, but close enough to turn the pages of her sheet music when needed. One of the few opportunities for their hands to brush, however briefly, however accidentally. These parlour visits were never spontaneous affairs. A gentleman didn't simply appear at a lady's door, hoping to find her at home. Instead, he would send his calling card in advance. A small, elegantly engraved piece of cardstock that announced his intention to pay his respects at a particular time on a particular day. If the family was willing to receive him, word would be sent back through appropriate channels. If not, his card would be returned with polite regrets. The ritual of calling cards was an art form in itself. The paper had to be of the finest quality, the engraving perfect, the wording impeccable. A gentleman's card was simple, his name, perhaps his address, nothing more, but even these sparse details conveyed volumes about his social standing, his attention to proper form, his seriousness of intent. Parlour games provided welcome relief from the sometimes stilted nature of these formal conversations. Charades, 20 questions, and various card games offered opportunities for laughter and mild competition while still maintaining the boundaries of propriety. A young lady might reveal something of her wit during a game of word association, or a gentleman might display his good humour and sporting nature during a round of spillikins, a Victorian game rather like our modern pick-up sticks. As winter evenings drew in and the candles were lit earlier each day, these parlour courtships took on an even more intimate quality. The flickering candlelights softened faces and created pools of warm light that drew the participants closer together, though never inappropriately so. The sound of the fire crackling in the grate, the soft rustle of silk skirts as a lady adjusted her position in her chair, the gentle tick of the mantel clock marking the passage of precious minutes. All of these sensory details combine to create an atmosphere of quiet romance that, though highly controlled, was no less meaningful for its restraint. In the gas-lit world of Victorian courtship, where direct communication between young people was heavily circumscribed by social convention, an entire vocabulary of silent signals developed. Like flowers opening in a moonlit garden, these subtle forms of communication bloomed in the spaces between spoken words, allowing hearts to speak when voices could not. The fan, that most essential of feminine accessories, became perhaps the most eloquent interpreter of unspoken feelings. Every young lady of good breeding owned several fans, delicate confections of silk, lace, ivory, and mother of pearl that served not merely to provide cooling relief during warm afternoons, but as instruments of the most sophisticated, silent conversation imaginable. The language of the fan was taught alongside embroidery and piano playing, passed down from mothers to daughters like a secret code. To carry a fan in the left hand meant I desire to make your acquaintance. Drawing the fan across the forehead signalled we are being watched. A fan pressed to the lips whispered, "Kiss me," while a fan snapped shut declared, "I wish to speak with you." Picture a young woman at an evening party, dressed in a gown of ivory silk, trimmed with Brussels lace, her dark hair arranged in an elaborate chignon, adorned with small white roses. She stands beside the marble mantelpiece, seemingly absorbed in conversation with her aunt about the quality of this year's strawberry preserves. But watch her fan, how it moves in her gloved hands like a butterfly settling on different flowers. She holds it in her right hand against her heart. My affections are engaged. Then, catching sight of a particular gentleman across the room, she shifts it to her left hand and draws it across her cheek. "I love you." The gentleman in question, if he is versed in this silent language, understands perfectly. He cannot approach directly, that would be unseemly, but he can position himself near the refreshment table, where convention might allow for a brief chaperoned conversation. Or perhaps he might request an introduction from their mutual hostess, though he must be careful not to appear too eager, lest he give offence or create gossip. Flowers, too, carried their own complex vocabulary of meaning. The Victorian language of flowers, or floriography, was as detailed as any dictionary. A single red rose declared passionate love, while yellow roses spoke of jealousy or declining affection. White roses whispered of pure spiritual love. Pink roses suggested grace and gentility. Even the way flowers were presented carried meaning. Given upside down, they conveyed the opposites of their traditional message. A young man courting a lady might spend considerable time consulting flower guides before selecting a bouquet. Should he send white jasmine for amiability, or would red camellias declaring, "You're a flame in my heart," be more appropriate? Perhaps a mixed bouquet would be safer. white lilacs for the innocence of first love, combined with pink roses for admiration and red tulips for a declaration of love. But he must be careful not to include any yellow flowers by mistake, lest he accidentally communicate jealousy or infidelity. The receiving of flowers was itself an art. A lady might wear a particular bloom in her hair or at her throat to signal her response to a suitor's message. If she appeared the next day with his white roses pinned to her bodice, he could take heart that his message was favourably received. If she wore different flowers entirely, or none at all, he understood that his suit was not progressing as hoped. Even seemingly innocent objects could carry romantic meaning. A dropped handkerchief was never merely an accident in the Victorian world, it was an invitation to pursue. The gentleman who noticed and politely retrieved it had been given permission to approach and make conversation. The colour of the handkerchief could modify the message: white for innocence, pink for affection, blue for faithfulness. Gloves too had their place in this silent conversation. To drop a glove was considered less forward than dropping a handkerchief, but still served as a gentle invitation. The way a lady pulled on or removed her gloves could communicate volumes. Loosening a glove while making eye contact might suggest, "I find you attractive," while keeping gloves firmly in place throughout an encounter could indicate, "Please maintain your distance." The positioning of jewellery carried meaning as well. A brooch worn over the heart suggested deep feeling, while the same brooch positioned on the shoulder might indicate casual interest. The way a lady touched her necklace during conversation, how she arranged her bracelet, where she placed her rings, all of these seemingly unconscious gestures were noted and interpreted by those fluent in the language of Victorian courtship. Even the act of reading could become a form of communication. A young lady seated in a garden pavilion with a volume of romantic poetry open in her lap was sending a different message than one absorbed in a book of household management. The choice of what to read in public, where to sit while reading, whether to glance up when a particular gentleman passed by, all of these details contributed to the ongoing conversation of courtship. As you listen to these tales of silent communication, perhaps you can hear the soft whisper of silk fans opening and closing, the gentle rustle of flower petals being arranged in a vase, the quiet sigh of a love letter being tucked away in a jewel box. The Victorian world was one where every gesture carried weight, where the smallest movement of a gloved hand could speak volumes, where hearts learned to sing in whispers rather than shouts. In the dim glow of candlelight, with the soft scratch of quill pen against paper providing the only sound beyond the gentle patter of rain against diamond-paned windows, the true romance of the Victorian era unfolded. For it was in the written word that Victorian lovers found their voices, their hearts, their deepest truths. Love letters became the secret gardens where feelings could bloom without the watchful eyes of society, where passion could be expressed in purple prose and flowery metaphors that would have been unseemly if spoken aloud. The art of letter writing was considered as essential to a proper education as dancing or needlework. Young people spent hours perfecting their penmanship, learning to craft sentences that flowed like music across the page. The quality of one's stationery spoke volumes about breeding and social standing. Only the finest paper would do, often with personal monograms embossed in gold or silver, sealed with coloured wax impressed with the family crest. A courtship conducted largely through correspondence could span months, or even years. Some couples exchanged dozens of letters before they were ever permitted to walk together unchaperoned. Each letter was a treasure to be read and reread, pressed between the pages of favourite books, tied with silk ribbons and hidden away in secret compartments of writing desks. The anticipation of receiving a letter was exquisite torture. Watching from parlour windows for the daily arrival of the post, heart racing at the sight of familiar handwriting on an envelope. Picture Eleanor Whitmore, a young lady of 20 summers, seated at her escritoire in the morning room of her family's Belgrave Square home. The year is 1878, and she's been corresponding with Lieutenant James Ashworth for 6 months now, ever since they were introduced at her cousin's wedding. Sunlight streams through the tall windows, illuminating the ivory paper spread before her, the silver inkwell, the small bouquet of violets in a crystal vase, his violets, sent just yesterday with a card bearing only the words, "For remembrance." Her letter begins, as all proper correspondence must, with inquiries about his health and well-being. But as her pen moves across the page, her words gradually warm, like a fire being carefully tended. She tells him about the book of poetry she's been reading, Mr. Browning's latest volume, and quotes a passage that particularly moved her, knowing he will understand the deeper meaning behind her choice. She describes her morning walk in Hyde Park, how the early mist clung to the trees and made everything seem mysterious and romantic, and mentions casually that she followed the same path they walked together last Sunday, under the careful supervision of her lady's maid. The lieutenant's replies are equally circumspect on the surface, yet burning with barely contained feeling beneath the proper phrases. He writes of his duties at the barracks, but more importantly, he shares his thoughts on the book she has recommended, the music they both enjoy, his hopes and dreams for the future. Between the lines, in the careful choice of words, and the occasional pressed flower tucked into the envelope, he declares his growing devotion with all the fervour his formal upbringing will allow. These letters served multiple purposes in Victorian courtship. They allowed couples to know each other's minds and hearts in ways that brief, supervised parlour visits could never accomplish. A gentleman's letters revealed his education, his moral character, his ability to support a family through the quality of his penmanship and the depth of his thoughts. A lady's correspondence demonstrated her accomplishments, her wit, her domestic virtues and her faithfulness. For a woman who answered letters promptly was considered reliable and well-bred. But letters were also dangerous in the Victorian world. A compromising letter that fell into the wrong hands could ruin reputations and end engagements. Young ladies were taught to be circumspect even in their private correspondence, to avoid anything that could be construed as forward or inappropriate. Gentlemen too had to be careful not to presume too much or declare their feelings too openly before the relationship had progressed to an appropriate stage. While letters provided a private space for the expression of feeling, the physical world of Victorian courtship remained heavily supervised. The institution of the chaperone was absolutely central to proper courtship. No respectable young lady was ever left alone with a gentleman who was not a close family member. Even engaged couples were rarely permitted complete privacy until after their wedding day. The role of chaperone usually fell to an older female relative, a mother, aunt or married sister, though sometimes a trusted family servant might suffice for less formal occasions. The chaperone's job was not merely to prevent impropriety, but to observe the suitor's behaviour and report back to the family on his suitability as a potential husband. Did he treat servants with courtesy? Did he display appropriate reverence during grace before meals? Was he gentle with children and animals? These details mattered enormously in a world where marriage was viewed as a lifelong commitment that would unite not just two individuals, but two families. A walk in the park, that seemingly simple pleasure, became an elaborate production in the Victorian era. The gentleman would first obtain permission from the lady's parents to escort their daughter for a promenade. The time and route would be agreed upon in advance. The chaperone would accompany them, walking at a discreet distance, but close enough to observe their interaction. The conversation would be carefully managed, nothing too personal, nothing that could be overheard and misconstrued. Yet within these constraints, romance bloomed. The brush of fingers when he helped her over a puddle, the way she leaned slightly toward him when pointing out a particularly beautiful flower, the meaningful glances exchanged when the chaperone was momentarily distracted by an acquaintance. These tiny moments carried enormous weight in the slowly building symphony of Victorian courtship. Carriage rides represented another significant step forward in a courtship. To be invited to accompany a gentleman in his carriage was a mark of serious intent, but again, never without proper supervision. The chaperone would sit facing the couple, making conversation impossible on intimate topics, but allowing for the quiet pleasure of shared scenery and the gentle rocking motion of the carriage as it moved through the countryside or city streets. As gas lamps begin to flicker to life in the gathering dusk of memory, you can almost hear the horses' hooves clip-clopping along cobblestone streets, the soft creak of carriage springs, the whisper of silk skirts and the gentle murmur of carefully proper conversation floating through the evening air. The transformation from casual acquaintance to serious courtship in Victorian society was marked by a series of carefully orchestrated gestures and gifts, each one carrying profound significance in the complex grammar of 19th century romance. Like the opening notes of a symphony, these early signs of serious intent announced to family, friends and society at large that a gentleman's interests had moved beyond mere social pleasantness to something far more consequential. The first gift a gentleman might offer was typically flowers, not the elaborate bouquets of later courtship, but perhaps a single, perfect rose or a small nosegay of violets with his calling card. The choice of flower was crucial, as we have seen, but equally important was the manner of presentation. Flowers delivered by a servant suggested casual politeness. Flowers presented in person during a formal call indicated rising interest. But flowers chosen and arranged by the gentleman's own hand, perhaps with a brief note written in his own careful script, announced serious romantic consideration. Books represented another acceptable early gift, though even here careful thought was required. A volume of improving essays or moral instruction was safely proper, but hardly romantic. A book of poetry, however, especially if it contained pressed flowers, as bookmarks or marginalia in the gentleman's hand, spoke to deeper feelings. Popular choices included volumes of Tennyson, Browning, or perhaps Byron for the more daring suitor, though Byron's reputation for scandal made his works a risky choice for a gentleman hoping to impress conservative parents. Picture James Ashworth, our lieutenant from earlier chapters, standing in Hatchard's bookshop on Piccadilly Street on a grey March morning in 1879. He has been corresponding with Miss Eleanor Whitmore for nearly a year now, and their carefully supervised walks in Hyde Park have convinced him that his feelings are reciprocated. Today, he seeks the perfect gift to signal his growing attachment without overstepping the bounds of propriety. He moves slowly through the leather-bound volumes, the scent of paper and binding glue, creating an atmosphere of scholarly contemplation. His gloved fingers trace the spines of various books. Here, a collection of moral essays by Dr. Johnson, there, a volume of nature poetry by Wordsworth. But it is a slim volume of Elizabeth Barrett Browning's Sonnets from the Portuguese that captures his attention. The binding is exquisite, burgundy leather with gold lettering, and the poems speak of love with a passion that is, intense yet respectable, being the work of a properly married woman writing about her courtship with her poet husband. When Eleanor receives this gift, she understands immediately its significance. She's moved beyond the realm of casual friendship in Lieutenant Ashworth's estimation. That evening, by the light of her bedroom candle, she reads Sonnet 43, "How do I love thee? Let me count the ways," and her heart beats faster as she imagines him selecting this particular poem with her in mind. Jewellery represented an even more serious step in Victorian courtship, though it had to be chosen with exquisite care. Anything too expensive or too intimate would be considered inappropriate from a gentleman who was not yet formally engaged. A simple brooch with the gentleman's initials, perhaps, or a locket containing a pressed flower from one of their walks together. These gifts served multiple purposes. They were tokens of affection, but they also marked the lady as being under a gentleman's particular protection, warning other potential suitors that her affections were likely engaged. The most significant step, however, came when a gentleman requested formal permission from a lady's father to pay his addresses to her. In other words, to court her with the serious intention of marriage. This conversation, usually conducted in the father's study over brandy and cigars, was a nerve-wracking ordeal for even the most confident suitor. The gentleman had to demonstrate not only his affection for the young lady, but his ability to support her in the style to which she was accustomed. The father's questions could be probing and detailed. What were the gentleman's prospects for advancement in his profession? What was the state of his finances, his debts, his investments? Did he own property, or was he dependent upon family money? What kind of household could he provide for a wife? How many servants would he be able to employ? These practical considerations were not seen as mercenary, but as prudent protection of a daughter's future welfare. If the father gave his blessing, and this was by no means guaranteed regardless of the young people's feelings for each other, the courtship could proceed to a more formal stage. The gentleman would be welcomed more frequently at family dinners, invited to accompany the family to church or to evening entertainments. His gifts could become slightly more personal, though still within strict bounds of propriety. The lady's response to these escalating gestures was equally important. If she wore his flowers prominently when they met, if she carried his book of poetry openly in the drawing room, if she mentioned his name frequently in conversation with family members, these were all signs that his attentions were welcomed. But if she thanked him politely for his gifts and then set them aside, if she seemed distracted during their conversations or failed to respond promptly to his letters, a wise gentleman would understand that his suit was not prospering and would gradually withdraw his attentions before formal rejection became necessary. The concept of understanding was crucial to this phase of Victorian courtship. An understanding between two young people was not quite an engagement, but it was a recognition that their relationship was moving in that direction with the approval of both families. During this period, they might be granted slightly more freedom, perhaps brief moments alone in the garden during family gatherings, or the privilege of addressing each other by their Christian names in private. This delicate dance of escalating commitment could continue for months or even years. Victorian society valued patience and gradual development of feeling over passionate impulse. The slow building of trust, understanding, and mutual respect was seen as the foundation of a successful marriage, and rushing toward engagement was viewed with suspicion by parents and society alike. As evening settles around us and the candles burn lower in their brass holders, we can imagine the careful weighing of every gesture, every gift, every word in these courtships of long ago. Romance moved at the pace of seasons changing, with each small step forward marking a milestone on the carefully mapped journey toward eventual marriage. The moment of proposal in Victorian society was orchestrated with all the solemnity of a religious ceremony, carrying weight that would echo through generations. Unlike our modern understanding of engagement as a happy trial period, a Victorian engagement was considered nearly as binding as marriage itself, and the reputation of both parties hung in the delicate balance of this most serious commitment. When Lieutenant James Ashworth finally felt the time was right to propose to Miss Eleanor Whitmore in the spring of 1880, he had been preparing for this moment for months. The proposal itself required careful staging. It could not be too public, lest it embarrass the lady if she felt compelled to refuse, yet it could not be completely private, as that would compromise her reputation. The morning room of her family's home, with her mother reading nearby in the adjoining sitting room, provided the perfect balance of intimacy and propriety. The actual words of a Victorian proposal followed certain conventional patterns. A gentleman did not simply blurt out his feelings, but rather built to his declaration through careful rhetoric. He might begin by speaking of his deep respect and admiration for the lady's character, her accomplishments, her virtue. He would acknowledge his unworthiness of her affections, while simultaneously asserting his ability to provide for her comfort and happiness. Only then would he formally request the honour of her hand in marriage. Eleanor's response too was constrained by convention. Even if her heart leapt with joy at his words, she could not immediately accept. Proper form required that she ask for time to consider his proposal, even if she had been hoping for this moment for months. A lady who accepted too quickly was considered forward, while one who refused too abruptly might be thought heartless. The delicate art lay in communicating her true feelings while maintaining the appearance of maidenly modesty. Once an engagement was formally announced, typically through a notice in the Times or other respectable newspaper, as well as personal letters to family and friends, the couple entered a new phase of their relationship. They were now permitted certain intimacies previously forbidden. They might address each other by their Christian names in the presence of family, take walks together with only minimal supervision, and exchange small gifts of a more personal nature. The engagement ring, that modern symbol of betrothal, was not yet the universal custom it would later become. Many Victorian couples exchanged simple gold bands, or the gentleman might present his fiancée with a family heirloom, perhaps his grandmother's pearls, or a brooch that had been passed down through generations. When gemstone rings were given, they often carried symbolic meaning: diamonds for constancy, sapphires for faithfulness, rubies for passion tempered by virtue. But engagement in the Victorian era was fraught with dangers to reputation that modern couples can barely imagine. Any whisper of scandal, any suggestion of impropriety could destroy a young woman's social standing forever. The concept of feminine virtue was not merely about physical chastity, but encompassed a complex web of behavioural expectations that governed every aspect of a lady's conduct. Consider the tragic case of Miss Arabella Thornton, a fictional but representative example of how quickly reputation could be lost. She'd been engaged for 6 months to Mr. Charles Fairfax, a respectable barrister, when she was seen walking unaccompanied with another gentleman in Kensington Gardens. The gentleman in question was actually her cousin, recently returned from India, but the circumstances looked suspicious to those who observed them. Within days, whispers began circulating through London society. Had Miss Thornton been conducting a clandestine affair? Was she the sort of woman who could not be trusted to honour her engagements? Mr. Fairfax, under pressure from his family, and concerned about his own reputation, felt compelled to break their engagement. Miss Thornton's protestations of innocence fell on deaf ears. Society had rendered its judgment, and she found herself effectively banished from respectable circles. Her family was forced to send her to distant relatives in Scotland, where she lived in virtual exile for the remainder of her days. This was not an uncommon fate. Victorian society was unforgiving of women who transgressed its complex moral codes, and the burden of maintaining family honour fell disproportionately on feminine shoulders. A man might recover from a minor scandal through displays of reformed behaviour, but a woman's reputation, once tarnished, was nearly impossible to restore. The engagement period itself was carefully managed to minimise such risks. Engaged couples were still rarely left completely alone together. Their correspondence, while more frequent and affectionate than during the courtship phase, was still subject to potential family scrutiny. Physical contact remained strictly limited. A kiss upon the forehead at the moment of engagement, perhaps the holding of hands during particularly emotional conversations, but nothing that could be construed as passionate or improper. The preparation for marriage during engagement involved intensive education for the bride-to-be in domestic management. She would study household accounts, learn to manage servants, and perfect her skills in the feminine accomplishments expected of a wife: needlework, music, drawing, and the subtle art of social conversation. Books like Mrs. Beeton's Book of Household Management became her Bible, as she prepared to take on the enormous responsibility of running a Victorian household. The trousseau, the collection of clothing, linens, and household items a bride brought to her marriage, required months of preparation. Every sheet, every pillowcase, every towel had to be embroidered with the bride's new married initials. Her wedding dress was often accompanied by a dozen or more other gowns suitable for various social occasions. The preparation of the trousseau was both a practical necessity and a display of the bride's family's wealth and status. Engagements could last anywhere from 6 months to several years, depending on the financial circumstances of the groom and the wishes of both families. During this time, the couple's relationship was considered semi-public. Their attachment was acknowledged and celebrated, but they remained under the protective oversight of their families and society. Breaking an engagement was a serious matter with potentially devastating consequences, particularly for the woman involved. If a gentleman broke his engagement without compelling cause, he might find himself socially ostracised and potentially liable for financial damages to the lady's family. If a lady broke her engagement, she faced the possibility of lifelong spinsterhood, as few men would risk courting someone who had proven herself unreliable in matters of the heart. As midnight chimes softly in the distance and the last embers glow in the fireplace, we can imagine the weight of these commitments, the careful balance of hope and fear that characterised Victorian engagements, and the immense social machinery that surrounded these most personal of human bonds. The wedding day itself marked not a beginning, but a transformation as complete and irreversible as caterpillar becoming butterfly. When Eleanor Whitmore walked down the aisle of St George's, Hanover Square, on a misty morning in October 1880, she was performing the final act in the elaborate drama of Victorian courtship. The girl who had fluttered her fan with such careful meaning 2 years earlier would emerge from the church as Mrs. James Ashworth, a married woman with entirely new duties, expectations, and social standing. Victorian weddings were affairs of considerable formality, though they lacked many of the romantic flourishes we associate with modern ceremonies. The bride wore white, a fashion popularised by Queen Victoria herself at her marriage to Prince Albert, but the colour symbolised purity and virtue rather than joy or celebration. Her dress was typically modest in design, with long sleeves, a high neckline, and a train that spoke to her family's wealth and status. Orange blossoms in her hair and bouquet represented fertility and new life, while the veil that covered her face until the moment of pronouncement symbolized her transition from maiden to matron. The ceremony itself was brief and businesslike, conducted according to the Book of Common Prayer, with little room for personal expression or romantic sentiment. The focus was on the legal and spiritual binding of two souls rather than the celebration of love. Guests stood throughout the service, and there was no music save for a simple hymn or psalm. After the ceremony, the wedding breakfast, actually a formal luncheon, brought together the families and closest friends. The conversation was polite and restrained, the toasts brief and proper. The bride and groom had little opportunity for private conversation, being constantly surrounded by well-wishers and family members, ensuring that all proprieties were observed, even on this most special of days. For many Victorian wives, marriage marked the end of the freedoms they had enjoyed as single women. The legal doctrine of coverture meant that a married woman's property, earnings, and even legal identity became subsumed into her husband's. She could not sign contracts, could not vote, could not even seek medical treatment without her husband's permission. Her world contracted to the domestic sphere, her home, her children, her husband's comfort and social advancement. Yet within these constraints, many Victorian marriages bloomed into genuine partnerships of affection and mutual respect. The slow courtship that had brought couples together often created strong foundations of friendship and understanding. Eleanor and James, having spent 2 years learning each other's minds through letters and carefully supervised conversations, entered marriage as true companions who had chosen each other with deliberation and growing love. The honeymoon, a relatively new Victorian invention, provided the couple's first opportunity for true privacy. A journey to the seaside, perhaps Brighton or Bath, or, for the more adventurous, a tour of the continent, allowed them to begin building their new life together, away from the watchful eyes of family and society. These trips were typically brief, however, as the husband usually had professional obligations that could not be long neglected. Upon returning home, the new wife faced the enormous task of establishing and managing her own household. Even modest, middle-class homes required careful management, overseeing servants, planning meals, maintaining social obligations, keeping detailed household accounts. The skills she had learned during her engagement period now became daily necessities rather than theoretical knowledge. For women, marriage often meant the swift arrival of children and the attendant responsibilities of motherhood. Victorian families were typically large, and pregnancy was a frequent condition that further restricted a woman's movements and activities. The drawing room accomplishments that had made her attractive during courtship, piano playing, watercolour painting, French conversation, often became distant memories as the practical demands of domestic life took precedence. Some Victorian marriages were love matches, the natural culmination of genuine romantic attachment, carefully nurtured through proper courtship. Others were marriages of convenience, arranged by families for financial or social advantage, though even these often developed into affectionate partnerships over time. The Victorian belief in duty, patience, and gradual development of feeling meant that many couples found happiness even in unions that had not begun with passionate love. The husband's role, too, changed dramatically with marriage. No longer the romantic suitor presenting flowers and poetry, he became the head of household, responsible for his family's financial security and social standing. His wife's reputation became his reputation, her behaviour a reflection of his worthiness as husband and provider. The passionate letters of courtship gave way to the practical discussions of domestic management and social obligations. As the years passed and the first flush of newlywed adjustment faded into the comfortable rhythms of established marriage, many Victorian couples looked back on their courtship with fond nostalgia. The carefully orchestrated dance of fan language and flower meanings, the nervous excitement of chaperoned walks, the trembling anticipation of love letters, all of these became cherished memories of a time when love was a careful, patient, deliberate cultivation, rather than a sudden overwhelming passion. Yet within the constraints of their society, Victorian lovers found ways to express deep and lasting devotion. Their love letters, preserved in family archives, reveal hearts that beat with the same hopes and fears, the same longing and joy that have characterised human romance throughout history. The difference lay not in the depth of feeling, but in the elaborate social choreography that governed its expression. And so we close our gentle exploration of love in the gaslit world of Victorian England. As the last carriage wheels fade into the distance and the final candle flickers out in the parlour window, we leave behind a world where romance moved at the pace of seasons, where every glance carried meaning, and where the greatest intimacy might be found in the space between written words on cream-coloured paper. Perhaps there is something to be learned from this slower, more deliberate approach to matters of the heart. In our modern world of instant communication and casual connection, the Victorian model of patient courtship, careful consideration, and gradual deepening of affection offers a different way of understanding love, not as a lightning strike of passion, but as a garden carefully tended, slowly cultivated, and designed to bloom for a lifetime. The young people who navigated these complex social waters may seem strange to us now, bound by rules we can barely understand, limited by restrictions we would find suffocating. Yet within those limitations, they found ways to communicate the deepest truths of the human heart. Their love was no less real for being constrained, their passion no less genuine for being properly channeled, their romance no less meaningful for being conducted in whispers rather than shouts. As you drift towards sleep tonight, perhaps you can hear the echo of those distant voices, the rustle of silk fans opening and closing in drawing rooms lit by gaslight, the scratch of quill pens writing love letters by candlelight, the soft clip-clop of horses' hooves, carrying couples on carefully chaperoned carriage rides through Hyde Park. These are the sounds of a world where love was treated with reverence, where courtship was an art form, and where the human heart learned to speak in the most delicate of whispers. The fog rolls in from the Thames, the gas lamps flicker and dim along empty London streets, and somewhere in the distance a church bell tolls the midnight hour. The carriages have all returned to their coach houses, the parlour doors have been closed for the night, and the last love letter has been sealed with wax and tucked away in a satin-lined drawer. And now, as the rain begins to fall gently against the windows and the fire settles into glowing embers, we close the door on this forgotten world of Victorian romance, carrying with us the memory of a time when love moved slowly, deliberately, and with infinite care, when courtship was a dance as intricate as lace, and when the greatest passion was found in patience itself. Sleep well, dear listener, and dream of gaslight and roses, of whispered promises and careful glances, of a world where love was a treasure, too precious to be rushed, too sacred to be casual, and too beautiful to be anything less than perfect in its restraint. Sweet dreams. And until we meet again in another tale from History Tales,